She was sent as a mail-order bride to humiliate him, a cruel joke orchestrated by those who wished to see the stoic cowboy break. But what they never expected was that beneath his weathered exterior beat a heart that refused to compound suffering with more pain. The moment he looked into her uncertain eyes, he knew he couldn't let her leave, not to face the shame of returning unwanted, not to endure whatever hardships had driven her to his doorstep in the first place. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the Whitfield mansion on Fifth Avenue, bathing the drawing room in golden light that belied the coldness of the conversation taking place. Ruth Whitfield stood with her hands clasped tightly before her, her knuckles white as she endured yet another of her mother's cutting assessments. "You have become an embarrassment to this family," Margaret Whitfield declared, her voice as crisp as her perfectly arranged silver hair. 24 years old, jilted by Charles, and still unmarried. What use are you to anyone now? Ruth swallowed hard, fighting back tears that would only fuel her mother's contempt. The pain of Charles Ashford's rejection still stung, though it was his cruelty during their courtship she was truly relieved to escape. "I've arranged a solution with Mr. Thornberry," the older woman continued, circling Ruth like a predator. "You're to be sent west as a mail-order bride, to Wyoming." She pronounced the territory's name as though it were a disease. "Wyoming?" Ruth whispered, her refined voice trembling. "Mother, you cannot be serious." Margaret's laugh was brittle. "Oh, but I am. The papers are already signed. You'll be married to some illiterate cowboy who requested a bride through Thornberry's agency." "This is punishment, not a solution," Ruth protested, finally finding her voice. Her mother's eyes narrowed. "Consider it both. The man doesn't know who you are. He thinks he's getting a willing bride. The jest is rather amusing, don't you think? A Whitfield, scrubbing floors in a wilderness cabin." Ruth felt her world tilting. "And when I fail, when I cannot possibly meet the expectations of frontier life, then you'll return in disgrace, properly humbled," Margaret replied with chilling certainty. "Perhaps then you'll appreciate what your stubbornness has cost this family." The weight of her mother's words pressed down on Ruth's shoulders. She had never learned to cook or clean, had never needed to. Her education had prepared her for society parties and proper conversation, not survival in the wilds of Wyoming. "The train leaves tomorrow," her mother said, turning away as if the matter were settled. "Pack only what you can carry. Your new husband won't have servants to manage your trunks." That night, Ruth sat alone in her bedroom, staring at the small valise she'd filled with impractical dresses and delicate gloves. Her life had changed in an instant, her future now bound to an unknown man in an unknown place, all because she had failed to be the daughter her mother wanted. She brushed away a tear, wondering what kind of man awaited her in Wyoming and whether he would be as cruel as the joke that was sending her to him. Ruth Whitfield sat at her vanity that night, staring at her reflection as the weight of her mother's words settled over her like a shroud. The broken engagement to Charles Ashford had been scandal enough, but now this, shipped off to Wyoming like unwanted cargo, a punishment for failing to secure a proper marriage. Her fingers traced the edge of the matrimonial agency papers, already signed and sealed with her fate. "A mail-order bride," she whispered to herself, the words foreign on her tongue. Not a wife chosen with care, but a punishment disguised as opportunity. Her mother's final barb still stung. "Perhaps you'll learn gratitude in the wilderness." Ruth knew the truth. She was being exiled for the crime of being herself, for speaking her mind when silence was expected, for wanting more than an arrangement of convenience. 1,000 miles away, Eli Harper moved through his evening routine with practiced efficiency. The Wyoming ranch was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the cabin and the soft padding of Ranger's paws across the wooden floor. The old dog, graying around the muzzle, watched as his master stoked the fire against the evening chill. "Just you and me again tonight, old friend," Eli murmured, his left hand stiff as he scratched behind Ranger's ears. The war had taken more than his brother James. It had left his hand a reminder of battles fought and survived. The ranch, once bustling with family, now echoed with their absence. The letter had arrived that morning, carried by Ben Morrison, who made the weekly journey from Willow Creek with supplies and mail. Eli had read it 3 times, scarcely believing the words. The matrimonial agency, the one James had encouraged him to write to before the fever took him, had found him a match. Miss Ruth Whitfield of New York City would arrive by train in 2 weeks' time. "What do you make of that, Ranger?" he asked, the dog's tail thumping against the floor in response. "A city woman coming here." Eli looked around the cabin with new eyes. The simple furnishings, the worn but clean quilts, the books stacked neatly by the hearth. It was humble but honest, like the man himself. Would it be enough for a woman accustomed to New York society? That night, he swept the floors, aired the bedding, and made a list of supplies to fetch from town. He would need sugar, coffee, perhaps fabric for curtains. The bedroom, James's once, would need preparing. Eli worked methodically, his movements deliberate, his mind racing with questions about the stranger who would soon share his home. "We'll make do," he told Ranger as they settled for the night. "We always have." As Ruth packed her trunks with dresses ill-suited for frontier life, and Eli readied his home for a bride he'd never met, neither could imagine how their lives would intertwine in the vast Wyoming wilderness. The morning of Ruth Whitfield's departure dawned gray and somber, matching her spirits perfectly. As she boarded the train in New York, clutching her single valise of hastily packed belongings, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her mother's final cold words. "When you fail, not if, when, do not expect to be welcomed back with open arms." Meanwhile in Wyoming, snow had begun falling in gentle flakes that gradually thickened as the day progressed. Eli Harper watched the sky with concern while preparing for his bride's arrival. He carefully folded extra wool blankets and retrieved his father's buffalo coat from the cedar chest where it had lain since the old man's passing 3 winters ago. The coat was heavy, worn at the elbows, but still warm, warmer than anything a city woman would likely bring to Wyoming in late autumn. For 4 days, Ruth endured the jarring rhythms of the train, watching as manicured gardens gave way to farmland, then rolling plains, and finally the rugged wilderness of the Western Territories. Each mile carried her further from everything familiar, from silk dresses and afternoon teas, from servants and comfort. By the time the conductor called out Willow Creek Station, she felt hollowed out, a shell of the society woman she'd been. The platform at Willow Creek was nothing more than weathered planks, dusted with snow and occupied by a handful of people. Ruth stepped down, her city boots immediately inadequate against the cold. She stood alone, abandoned in this alien landscape, watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air. "Miss Whitfield?" She turned to find a tall man regarding her with cautious eyes. Eli Harper was not what she had expected. Her mother's description of an illiterate cowboy had conjured images of crudeness, but the man before her carried himself with quiet dignity. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his shoulders broad beneath a worn sheepskin jacket. When he extended his right hand in greeting, she noticed how his left hung slightly awkward at his side, the fingers curled inward. "Mr. Harper," she acknowledged, her voice sounding thin in the vast openness. "Storm's coming in faster than expected," he said, gesturing toward the darkening sky. "Best we get moving." He helped load her trunk onto his wagon, movements efficient despite his impaired hand. When he offered his father's buffalo coat, Ruth hesitated only briefly before practical necessity overcame pride. The heavy garment enveloped her, smelling of cedar and leather and unknown histories. As they set off, snow began falling in earnest, transforming the landscape into a white wilderness. The silence between them stretched, broken, only by the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional snort from the horses. Ruth clutched the coat tighter around herself, wondering what sort of life awaited her at the end of this journey, and whether she possessed the strength to endure it. The journey had left Ruth Whitfield bone-weary, but nothing could have prepared her for the sight of Eli Harper's ranch. As they approached through the snow, the tiny cabin appeared like a lone sentinel against the vast Wyoming wilderness. It was a far cry from the Whitfield mansion on Fifth Avenue, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers. "It's not much," Eli said quietly, helping her down from the wagon, his injured left hand tucked awkwardly against his body. "But it's warm and dry." Ruth stepped inside, surprised to find the interior meticulously clean. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the simple wooden furniture. One room served as kitchen and living area combined, with a single door leading, she presumed, to a bedroom. "I've prepared the bedroom for you," the rancher explained, gesturing with his good hand. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." Ruth stood frozen, clutching her valise. The reality of her situation crashed down upon her. This humble cabin was now her home. No servants, no luxuries, just this quiet man and miles of emptiness stretching in every direction. "I made some stew," Eli offered, moving to the cast-iron stove where a pot simmered. "Nothing fancy, but it's hot." He ladled the simple meal into earthenware bowls with practiced movements, compensating for his war injury with quiet efficiency. Ruth watched him, noting how he never complained about the disability that clearly troubled him. "I should tell you," she began, her voice barely audible, "I don't know how to cook, or sew, or tend animals." The confession tumbled out in a rush. "I've never done any practical work in my life." Eli regarded her steadily across the table. "Those things can be learned," he said. "What matters is honesty between us." Ruth nodded, surprised by the lack of judgment in his tone. In New York, Charles would have mocked such inadequacies mercilessly. Margaret would have delivered a cutting remark about uselessness. As they ate in silence, Ruth studied her surroundings more carefully. A shelf of well-worn books, a mended shirt draped over a chair, a pair of boots, cleaned and set by the door. Everything spoke of care and order maintained by a solitary man. Exhaustion settled into her bones as the warmth of the cabin and food worked their magic. As Eli showed her to the bedroom, a small space with a neatly made bed and a patchwork quilt, Ruth found herself wondering if this punishment her parents had orchestrated might hold something unexpected. "Rest well," he said simply, closing the door behind him. Alone at last, Ruth sank onto the bed, too tired even to weep. Perhaps this punishment might become something entirely different from what Margaret and her father had intended. Something that, despite everything, might eventually feel like mercy. Ruth woke to a world transformed. Overnight, the blizzard had painted everything white, sealing them inside Eli's cabin with walls of wind and snow. Through frosted windows, she could barely make out the barn where his horses sheltered. The bitter cold seeped through every crack, making her shiver beneath the quilts. "It'll be like this for days," Eli Harper explained, stoking the fire. His movements were practiced, efficient, despite his damaged left hand. "Your city clothes won't do you any good out here." Ruth wrapped her arms around herself, embarrassed by her silk blouses and fine wool skirts, beautiful but useless against Wyoming winters. "I didn't know to pack differently." "No reason you would." His voice held no judgment. "There's work needs doing, even in weather like this. Would you help me?" The request surprised her. Back in New York, Margaret Whitfield would have scoffed at the idea of her daughter performing manual labor. Yet something in Eli's steady gaze made refusal impossible. He disappeared into the small back room, returning with folded garments. "These were James's. My brother," he explained, offering them awkwardly. "They'll be warm at least." Ruth hesitated only briefly before accepting. The clothes, heavy flannel shirts and wool trousers, smelled of cedar and something indefinable. Wearing a dead man's clothes should have felt morbid, but instead brought strange comfort. When she emerged dressed in James's clothing, Eli's eyes widened slightly before he nodded approval. Better for working. Together they ventured into the frozen world, Ruth following in Eli's footsteps through snow that reached her knees. The cold burned her lungs, but the borrowed clothes kept her surprisingly warm. At the barn, he showed her how to feed the animals, explaining each task with patience. "Your hand," she finally dared ask, watching him struggle with a stubborn knot. "Was it from birth?" "Shiloh," he answered simply. "Confederate bullet. Doctor saved what he could." Ruth tried to imagine it, the chaos of battle, pain, fear. "You fought in the war?" "James and I both. He made it through without a scratch." A sad smile crossed his weathered face. "Influenza took him 3 winters ago. Parents were already gone by then." The simplicity with which he stated such profound loss left Ruth speechless. This man had endured war, disability, and the death of his entire family, yet still rose each morning to tend his animals and pray at his window. It must be lonely, she ventured. Eli considered this as they walked back toward the cabin, the wind whipping around them. Land teaches you to be self-sufficient, he finally said, but yes, it gets quiet. That evening, as they shared a simple meal, Ruth found herself studying his face in the firelight. The strength required to survive here wasn't just physical, it was a resilience of spirit she'd never needed to develop in her sheltered life. For the first time, she felt something beyond resignation toward her situation, respect for the man who had welcomed her into his solitary world. The morning after their first venture outside, Ruth stared at the basin of water, her hands red and raw from yesterday's attempt at washing clothes. She'd torn 2 of her own garments and completely ruined one of Eli's shirts. Tears of frustration threatened, but she blinked them away. "You're holding the brush too tight," Eli Harper said gently, demonstrating with his good hand. "Let the bristles do the work." His voice carried no judgment, only patience. Ruth nodded, trying again. "In New York, servants handled these things. I feel utterly useless here." "Nobody's born knowing how to work a ranch," he replied, his weathered face softening. "James and I spent our first year making every mistake possible." Over the following days, Ruth's education continued. She learned to feed chickens without scattering grain everywhere, to collect eggs without breaking them, and to recognize when bread dough had risen properly. Each small victory felt monumental. "You're doing well," Eli would say, the corners of his eyes crinkling when she succeeded. When she failed, dropping a full pail of milk or oversalting the stew, he simply showed her again, his patience seemingly endless. One evening, as darkness fell early across the Wyoming landscape, Ruth noticed Eli standing by the eastern window. He removed his hat, bowed his head, and whispered words she couldn't quite hear. The rancher remained there for several minutes, his silhouette framed against the darkening sky. Later, as they sat by the fire, Ruth asked about it. "It's something James and I started during the war," he explained, his voice soft with memory. "We promised to look toward each other at sundown and say a prayer. After Shiloh, when I thought he was lost, I kept doing it. Then when he came home," Eli paused, his good hand absently rubbing his injured one. "It became our way of giving thanks." "Even after he passed?" Ruth asked. Eli nodded. "Especially then." That night, Ruth lay awake thinking about devotion, not just to God, but to memory, to promises. In the Whitfield household, appearances mattered more than substance. Her mother's affections were conditional, Charles's love proven false. Yet here was Eli, faithful to a ritual no one would ever witness or praise him for. The next evening, Ruth found herself standing beside him at the window. She didn't speak, simply joined him in his moment of reverence. When he finished, Eli looked at her with surprise and something deeper, gratitude. "Would you like to learn to ride tomorrow?" he asked. "I would," Ruth answered, realizing she meant it. In this quiet cabin, far from everything familiar, she was beginning to feel something, unexpected, seen. Ruth's body betrayed her 3 days after helping Eli repair the fence line in the bitter Wyoming cold. She woke in the night, her nightgown soaked with sweat, her teeth chattering uncontrollably despite the fire Eli had banked before retiring. "Eli," she called weakly, her voice barely carrying across the cabin. He was beside her in moments, his weathered face creased with concern as he pressed a calloused palm to her forehead. "You're burning up," he murmured, immediately moving to stoke the fire. Through the long night, Eli Harper never left her side. He bathed her feverish skin with cool cloths, coaxed water between her parched lips, and wrapped her in every blanket the cabin possessed. When even that wasn't enough, he added his father's buffalo coat, tucking it carefully around her trembling form. "Don't leave," Ruth whispered during a moment of clarity, her fingers weakly grasping his shirt sleeve. "I'm not going anywhere," the rancher promised, his voice gentle as he adjusted the compress on her forehead. Even his injured hand moved with purpose, determined to be useful in her care. In her delirium, Ruth drifted between past and present. She called for her mother, only to be met with Eli's steady reassurance. She apologized for being a burden, for not knowing how to split wood properly, for being the socialite who couldn't even light a stove without assistance. "You're doing fine," he soothed, his deep voice anchoring her to reality. "Just Stay with me, Ruth. Near dawn, when her fever peaked, Eli knelt beside the bed and prayed. The same window ritual he performed each night, but this time his words were meant for her ears alone. Lord, not her too. I've lost enough. Please, not her too. The raw emotion in his voice penetrated Ruth's fever haze. She reached out, finding his hand in the darkness, and held on. Morning brought mercy. Ruth woke to find her nightgown changed, her fever broken, and Eli slumped in a chair beside her bed, his head resting awkwardly against the wall. Ranger lay vigilant at his master's feet, the old dog's eyes tracking Ruth's movements. You stayed, she whispered. Eli startled awake, relief washing over his features. You're back, he said simply. Something fundamental had shifted between them. In the quiet morning light, Ruth saw him clearly for perhaps the first time, not as the lonely cowboy her parents had mocked, but as a man of profound devotion and gentle strength. Thank you, she managed, her voice still weak. He nodded, a hint of color touching his cheeks. Rest now. I'll bring some broth. As he moved toward the stove, Ruth watched him, understanding that what had begun as a cruel joke had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated, a fragile trust built through fever and prayer that neither New York society nor Wyoming winters could easily break. The fever left Ruth Whitfield weakened but determined. As her strength returned, she found herself eager to master the skills that had once seemed so foreign. The morning she first split wood successfully, her hands blistered but her spirits soaring, she caught Eli watching her with quiet approval. You're getting stronger, he said simply, the corner of his mouth lifting in that subtle way she was beginning to recognize as his smile. I never thought I could do this, Ruth admitted, examining her reddened palms. In New York, I wasn't even allowed to carry my own packages. Eli nodded, his weathered face thoughtful. Life here forces you to find strength you didn't know you had. Each day brought new challenges and small triumphs. Ruth learned to make biscuits that didn't resemble stones, to mend tears in clothing with neat, even stitches, and to predict weather changes by watching the sky. The cabin that had once felt like a prison gradually transformed into a sanctuary, a place where she could fail without ridicule and succeed without pretense. In the evenings, as winter's grip tightened outside, they settled into a comfortable routine. Ranger would curl at their feet while Eli taught Ruth how to repair harnesses or sharpen tools. Sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, the crackling fire and howling wind the only sounds. Tell me about your family, Ruth asked one night as they shared the last of the coffee. The rancher was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. Then, in his low, measured voice, he began to speak of his parents, his father's unwavering work ethic, his mother's gift for coaxing flowers to grow in the harsh Wyoming soil. He spoke of James, his brother, with a tenderness that made Ruth's heart ache. He could always make folks laugh, Eli said, absently rubbing his damaged hand, even during the worst of the war. Ruth listened, absorbing these pieces of his past, understanding how they had shaped the man beside her. In turn, she shared selective memories of her own childhood, the rare, happy moments before her mother's ambitions had overshadowed everything else. You know, Eli said one evening as Ruth successfully completed her first batch of stew, you're doing well here. The simple praise warmed her more than any elaborate compliment she'd received in society. She was learning to value different things now, the satisfaction of work well done, the peace of evenings spent in honest company, the way Eli never rushed to fill silences with empty words. That night, watching him at the window with his nightly prayers, Ruth realized something had fundamentally shifted within her. The ranch was no longer her punishment. Somehow, against all expectations, it was becoming her home. I don't think I can do this, Ruth Whitfield whispered, her gloved hands gripping the saddle horn as if it were the only thing keeping her from plummeting to her death. The mare beneath her, Duchess, stood patiently, seemingly unbothered by the nervous woman on her back. Eli stood at the horse's head, his good hand steady on the bridle. You're doing fine, he assured her, his voice calm and measured. Duchess here is the gentlest horse in Wyoming. She raised my brother and me, practically. Ruth took a deep breath, trying to loosen her death grip. The rancher had spent the morning showing her how to approach the animal, how to saddle her, and now, most terrifyingly, how to sit atop this enormous creature without falling off. Just relax your legs a bit, he instructed. Let them hang naturally. That's it. After several circuits of the corral, with Eli leading Duchess at a walk, Ruth felt her confidence growing. By midday, she was guiding the mare herself, using the reins as he had taught her. "I'm doing it," she called out, a genuine smile lighting her face. Eli nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. It was the first time she'd seen real pride in herself since arriving in Wyoming. The next day, they ventured beyond the corral. Eli rode his bay gelding alongside her as they followed a snow-packed trail through the valley. The vastness of the landscape still overwhelmed Ruth, but now it felt less threatening and more magnificent. "My brother James and I used to race from that pine to the creek," he said, pointing to landmarks as they rode. "He usually won. Always had a way with horses that I envied." Ruth listened, absorbing these pieces of his past. "You must miss him terribly." "Every day," he admitted. "But out here, sometimes I can almost feel him riding beside me." Their rides grew longer as Ruth's skill improved. Eli showed her how to spot deer tracks in the snow, taught her to recognize the distant howl of wolves from the yip of coyotes. Once, they dismounted by a frozen stream, and he pointed out otter slides along the bank. "In New York, I never noticed nature," she confessed. "It was all buildings and carriages and people. Here, everything is alive in a different way." The rancher nodded, understanding in his weathered face. "That's why I could never leave, even when times got hard. This land gets in your blood." As they rode home in the fading afternoon light, Ruth realized something had shifted inside her. The world had expanded beyond drawing rooms and social obligations. Here, astride Duchess with the Wyoming wind in her hair, she felt a freedom she'd never known, and a growing attachment to the quiet man who was teaching her to see with new eyes. The blizzard hit with a fury that made their earlier snowstorms seem like gentle flurries. Winds howled around the cabin, rattling the shutters and driving snow through every tiny crack. Ruth Whitfield stood at the window, watching the white world disappear into darkness as the storm intensified. She'd grown accustomed to Wyoming's weather, but this tempest was different, wild and dangerous. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered, pulling Eli's father's buffalo coat tighter around her shoulders. Eli joined her at the window, his tall frame casting a shadow in the lantern light. "Spring storms can be the worst. The changing seasons fight each other." A tremendous crack split the air, followed by a heavy thud that shook the entire structure. Ranger barked frantically as both Ruth and Eli rushed outside, fighting against the wind. A massive branch had broken from the old pine, punching a hole in the corner of the roof. "We need to cover it before the snow gets in," Eli shouted over the wind. Without hesitation, Ruth followed him to the barn, helping gather tools and tarpaulin. Working together on the roof, Ruth held boards steady while Eli hammered with his good hand. Her fingers were numb, her face stung by ice pellets, but she didn't complain. When she slipped, nearly sliding off the edge, his strong arm caught her, pulling her securely against him. Their eyes met, and despite the howling storm, something warm passed between them. Back inside, soaked and freezing, they collapsed by the stove, exhausted but triumphant. Ruth's hair had come loose, hanging in wet tangles around her face. To her surprise, Eli began to laugh, a deep, genuine sound she'd rarely heard from him. "What's so funny?" she asked, unable to keep from smiling. "Look at us," he said, gesturing to their sodden clothes and disheveled appearance. "Quite a pair of frontier heroes?" Ruth found herself laughing too, the tension of the crisis dissolving into unexpected joy. "My mother would faint dead away if she could see me now." "Would that be before or after she saw you splitting wood yesterday?" "Definitely after she watched me feeding the chickens in your brother's trousers." Their laughter filled the cabin, warming it more effectively than the stove. When it finally subsided, a comfortable silence settled between them. Ruth realized how much she'd changed. Her hands now bore calluses, her arms had gained strength, and her spirit had found resilience she never knew she possessed. "You're not the same woman who stepped off that train," Eli said softly, as if reading her thoughts. "Is that a good thing?" she asked, suddenly vulnerable. His eyes, steady and sincere, met hers. "The best thing." As the storm raged outside, they sat together in the glow of the lantern, no longer strangers forced together by circumstance, but companions who had weathered literal and figurative storms. Ruth felt something new taking root between them, a tenderness built on shared struggle and mutual respect that neither had anticipated, but both now cherished. The first signs of spring brought clearer skies to Wyoming, and with the mountain passes finally navigable, Eli suggested they make the journey into Willow Creek for supplies. Ruth Whitfield had been on the ranch for nearly 3 months now, and the thought of seeing other people both excited and terrified her. "You'll like the Pattersons," Eli said as he helped her into the wagon. "Martha makes the best apple pie west of the Mississippi." The ride into town was pleasant, with patches of green beginning to emerge from beneath the melting snow. Ruth found herself pointing out birds and new growth with childlike enthusiasm. Her hands, once soft and manicured, now bore calluses she wore with quiet pride. Willow Creek was hardly more than a main street with a handful of establishments, but after the isolation of winter, it seemed bustling to Ruth. At the general store, she was introduced to Martha and George Patterson, who welcomed her warmly. "So you're the brave New York lady who's been keeping our Eli company," Martha said, clasping Ruth's hands. "We've been dying to meet you." While Eli discussed feed prices with George, Ruth was enjoying tea with Martha when the bell above the door jingled. The moment froze as Charles Ashford strode in, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as distinctly out of place. "Ruth?" "Good heavens, it really is you," he drawled, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I scarcely recognized you in those clothes." Ruth's throat tightened. "Charles, what brings you to Wyoming?" "Business in Cheyenne. I heard the most amusing rumor about a Whitfield woman playing frontier wife." His eyes swept over her work dress and rough hands. "Your mother will be devastated to see what's become of you." Before she could respond, Eli appeared at her side, his presence solid and reassuring. "You must be Ashford," he said, his voice level but cold. Charles smirked. "And you're the cowboy. Tell me, does she burn everything she cooks? Back in New York, Ruth couldn't so much as boil water." "My wife," Eli emphasized the word, "makes a fine stew, and she splits wood better than most men I know." Ruth found her voice then. "I'm not the woman you knew in New York, Charles. This is my home now." "How quaint," Charles sneered. "Playing at being useful must be such a novelty for you." "I'd rather be useful here than ornamental there," Ruth replied, standing straighter. "Please give my regards to no one in particular." After Charles left, Eli's hand found hers. "You all right?" "Yes," she said, surprised to find it true. "He's a ghost from a life I don't miss." On the ride home, with supplies loaded and the sun setting behind them, Ruth realized the encounter had shaken, but also strengthened her. This hard-won life, this man beside her, these were worth defending against all the Charles Ashfords of the world. The embers in the stove cast a warm glow across the cabin as Ruth sat at the table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. Charles Ashford's cutting remarks in town had reopened old wounds, bringing forth memories of her mother's cold dismissal. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled, but it couldn't drown out the doubts swirling in her mind. "I don't know if I can ever be what you need," Ruth finally said, her voice barely audible. "Mother always said I was hopeless at domestic matters. Perhaps she was right." Eli looked up from his mending, setting aside the leather reins. "Your mother doesn't know the woman I've come to know these past months." "But what kind of wife am I? I still burn the biscuits. I can barely mend a shirt." Her eyes glistened in the lamplight. "You deserved someone who came to you honestly, someone skilled and capable." The rancher set his work aside completely, moving to sit across from her. His weathered face was earnest in the soft light. "I sent for a bride because the silence was eating me alive," he confessed. "After James died, this place felt like a tomb. I'd talk to Ranger just to hear a voice." Eli's good hand reached across the table, hesitant. "I never expected someone like you." "Someone useless," Ruth whispered. "Someone who tries, who falls and gets back up, who splits wood until her hands blister and never complains." His fingers brushed hers. "You've surprised me every day since you stepped off that train." Ruth felt something shift between them, a door opening to a room neither had dared enter. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of the work or the isolation, but of disappointing you." "You couldn't." Eli said simply. When he stood and moved around the table, Ruth rose to meet him. His hand, calloused from years of ranch work, gently cupped her cheek. She leaned into his touch, feeling the strength and tenderness there. Their first real kiss was hesitant, a question asked and answered in the space between heartbeats. Ruth felt herself trembling as his lips met hers, not from fear but from the overwhelming sense of coming home. When they parted, both were breathless. Eli stepped back, a flush creeping up his neck. "I didn't mean to presume." "You didn't," Ruth assured him, her own cheeks warm. An awkward silence followed, filled with possibility and uncertainty. They moved around each other carefully that evening, stealing glances, sharing shy smiles. Neither rushed to define what had changed between them, content to let this newfound tenderness unfold at its own pace. That night, as Ruth lay in bed listening to Eli's quiet movements in the main room, she realized that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she wanted to be. The letter arrived on a bitter Tuesday morning. Ben Morrison, the postmaster from Willow Creek, had ridden through the early snow to deliver it personally, his face grim beneath his frost-dusted hat. Ruth Whitfield took the envelope with trembling fingers, noting the New York return address. "There's something else," Ben said hesitantly, stomping his boots on the porch. "Charles Ashford's been staying at the hotel. He's telling everyone who'll listen about some bet involving you and Eli." Ruth's blood ran cold. She thanked Ben mechanically, watching him ride away before opening the letter. Inside was a gleeful note from her mother, detailing how Charles had traveled west specifically to expose the delicious joke they'd played on the crippled cowboy. That evening, when Eli returned from mending fences, he found Ruth sitting at the table, the letter spread before her. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting down his gloves. The words spilled out like poison. Ruth confessed everything. Her parents' scheme to humiliate him, the wager at their club about how long an educated woman would last with an illiterate cowboy, and her own desperate compliance to escape her mother's tyranny. "I never meant to stay," she whispered, unable to meet his eyes. "But then I met you and everything changed." Eli stood motionless, his weathered face a mask of pain. The silence stretched between them, vast as the Wyoming prairie. "You let me believe you came here in good faith," he finally said, his voice hollow. Without another word, he walked out, the door closing softly behind him. Ruth collapsed into tears. She had lost him, lost the one person who had truly seen her. By midnight, her decision was made. She packed a small bag and wrote a letter, pouring her heart onto the page. She explained how deeply she had come to love him, how the cruel joke had transformed into the most genuine thing in her life. She begged his forgiveness, but insisted he deserved better than a wife who had arrived under false pretenses. "Be happy, Eli," she concluded. "Know that you taught me what real strength is." She placed the letter on his pillow, alongside his mother's handkerchief he had once lent her. Outside, snow was falling heavily, but Ruth didn't hesitate. Wrapping herself in James's old coat, she stepped into the swirling white darkness. The wind cut through her like knives as she trudged toward town. Tears froze on her cheeks, but she pressed on. Better to disappear into the storm than to witness the contempt in Eli's eyes when he looked at her again. The blizzard raged with unforgiving fury, swallowing Ruth Whitfield's small figure as she stumbled through knee-deep snow. Her tears froze against her cheeks, each labored breath visible in the frigid air. The wind cut through James's borrowed clothes, now insufficient against nature's wrath. She had walked for what felt like hours, her fingers numb, her thoughts increasingly sluggish. When she tripped over a hidden rock, Ruth couldn't find the strength to rise again. As the snow began covering her, a strange warmth crept through her body, the dangerous comfort that preceded freezing to death. Her eyes grew heavy, thoughts of Eli's wounded expression the last thing on her mind. Back at the ranch, Eli paced frantically after finding her letter. Despite his anger, terror gripped his heart when he realized she had ventured into the storm. Without hesitation, he bundled up, whistled for Ranger, and rode out. The old dog, sensing urgency, pressed forward, against the howling wind, nose to the ground. It was Ranger who found her first, barking desperately at the half-buried form. Eli dismounted awkwardly with his impaired hand, digging through snow with desperate intensity. Ruth's face was pale as moonlight, her lips tinged blue. He gathered her against his chest, his voice breaking as he begged her to hold on. The journey back was a battle against time and elements. Eli sheltered her body with his own, whispering prayers into the wind. At the cabin, he worked methodically, stoking the fire, removing her frozen clothes, wrapping her in warm blankets, rubbing life back into her limbs. When Ruth finally opened her eyes, his face was the first thing she saw. Haggard, tear-streaked, relief washing over his features. "Why?" he whispered, his voice raw. "Why would you leave like that?" "You deserved better," she murmured weakly. "Someone who came to you honestly." Eli shook his head, taking her hand in his good one. "What hurt most wasn't how you came here or why. It was that you were ready to disappear rather than stay and fight for what we've built." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "I thought you couldn't forgive me." "The circumstances that brought you here don't matter anymore," he said. "What matters is who we've become together. This ranch, this life. It's ours now, not some joke your parents orchestrated." She reached up, touching his weathered face. "I'll never run again, I promise." "And I promise to remember that people can change," Eli replied, his voice gentle, "that how something begins doesn't dictate how it ends." They sat in silence, the fire crackling. Ranger settled at their feet. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, but inside the small cabin, something fragile was being mended, trust rebuilt, forgiveness offered, and the courage to move forward together despite the wounds of the past. The morning sun poured through the cabin windows as Ruth sat at the wooden table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. Her bruises from the snowstorm were fading, but the memory of Eli finding her, carrying her home through the blizzard, remained vivid. Outside, the Wyoming landscape was beginning to thaw, patches of grass emerging from beneath the snow. "The Pattersons asked about you yesterday," Eli said, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "Mrs. Patterson seems convinced you need more of her medicinal tea." Ruth smiled. "She's been kind. Everyone has been, despite—" She paused, the words catching in her throat. "Despite knowing why I came here." Eli set the coffee pot down and took a seat across from her. The rancher's eyes held hers steadily, the same calm gaze that had greeted her at Willow Creek Station months ago. "The rumors will die down," he said. "Folks around here judge by what they see, not what they hear. And what they see is a woman who's become part of this place." Ruth wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "I never imagined I could belong somewhere like this. When Mother and Mr. Thornberry arranged everything, they thought I'd fail spectacularly." "And instead?" Eli asked, his voice gentle. "Instead, I found home," she whispered. The rancher reached across the table with his good hand covering hers. His skin was rough from work, but his touch was tender. "Ruth," he began, then cleared his throat. "What happened between us? It started as something arranged, something neither of us chose. But now?" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'd like us to choose each other, properly. Not because of papers signed in New York, but because of what we've built here." Ruth's heart quickened. "Are you proposing to me, Eli Harper?" A smile broke across his weathered face. "I believe I am. I'm asking if you'll be my wife, not because you were sent to be, but because we both want it." Tears welled in Ruth's eyes as she thought of their journey, from strangers thrust together by circumstance to partners who had weathered illness, betrayal, and reconciliation. The former socialite who couldn't boil water now felt more herself in James's old clothes, helping with the ranch, than she ever had in her mother's drawing room. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, I choose you. I choose us." Eli stood, drawing her up with him. His arms encircled her, and Ruth Whitfield, who had once been shipped west as a cruel joke, found herself exactly where she belonged. "We'll make it official at the church in Willow Creek," he murmured against her hair. "Start fresh, with truth between us." Ruth nodded against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Their foundation was no longer built on deception, but on forgiveness, respect, and love that had grown in the most unexpected of places. The winter that had brought Ruth and Eli together now threatened to tear them apart. Influenza swept through Willow Creek like a silent predator, claiming victims with merciless efficiency. When Eli Harper stumbled through the cabin door one evening, his face ashen and his good hand trembling, Ruth knew immediately what had befallen him. "Just need to rest," he mumbled before collapsing onto their bed, still wearing his boots. Ruth worked methodically, removing his muddy footwear and outer garments. Within hours, fever consumed him. His skin burned beneath her touch as she placed cool cloths on his forehead. The ranch chores fell entirely to her now, feeding livestock, chopping wood, keeping the stove burning, all while tending to her husband's deteriorating condition. "You must fight," she whispered, spooning broth between his cracked lips. "I cannot do this alone." Days blurred together. Ruth slept in snatches, her body aching from exhaustion. She remembered how he had nursed her through fever months ago, his patience unwavering. Now she returned that devotion tenfold, applying every lesson learned during her transformation from pampered socialite to frontier wife. On the fourth night, Eli's fever peaked dangerously. Ruth sat beside him, clutching his hand while terror gripped her heart. His breathing came shallow and rapid. "James!" he called out in delirium. "Wait for me!" "No!" Ruth commanded, pressing her palm against his cheek. "Your brother can wait. I need you here." Through the long hours, Eli drifted between worlds. In lucid moments, his eyes would find hers, filled with a tenderness that broke her heart. "My Ruth," he murmured once, his voice barely audible. "I never told you enough. I love you, not just as my wife. I love everything about you." She wept then, pressing his feverish hand to her lips. "I know. I've always known." By morning, the fever finally broke. Ranger, who had maintained a faithful vigil at the foot of the bed, whined softly as if sensing the change. Ruth collapsed into the chair beside him, overcome with relief. When Eli finally opened his eyes with clarity 2 days later, Ruth was there, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes bright. "You stayed," he whispered. "Where else would I be?" she replied, smoothing back his hair. "I love you, Eli Harper, not because I must, but because you've shown me what love truly means." He reached for her with his good hand, drawing her close. "We've both been forged in fire, haven't we?" Ruth nodded, thinking of all they had endured, her humiliation, his injury, their mutual distrust, and now this illness. Each trial had strengthened rather than weakened what lay between them. "And we've emerged stronger for it," she said, resting her head against his chest to hear the steady beat of his heart, the most precious sound in her world. The night air carried a chill, but inside the cabin, warmth radiated from more than just the crackling fire. Eli Harper's recovery had brought a shift between them, something tangible yet unspoken. Ruth watched him across the room, his tall frame silhouetted against the firelight, his movements still cautious but growing stronger each day. "I thought I might lose you," she whispered, the memory of his fever-racked body still fresh. Eli turned, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. "But you didn't. You saved me, Ruth." That night, their bodies spoke what words could not fully express. His touch, gentle despite the roughness of his calloused hands, moved across her skin with reverence. Ruth felt herself opening like a flower long denied sunlight, every barrier between them dissolving. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be truly known, truly wanted, not as an ornament or a duty, but as herself, flawed, strong, and wholly loved. Afterward, lying in his arms, Ruth traced the scar on his left hand, the war wound that had once defined him to others but meant nothing to her except as part of the man she loved. "I have something for you," Eli said the following morning, retrieving a small wooden box from beneath a floorboard. Inside lay a simple gold band with a small pearl. "My mother's. Pa gave it to her when they first came west. I want you to have it, not because of any arrangement, but because I choose you, Ruth, every day." The ring slipped perfectly onto her finger, as though it had been waiting for her all along. 2 days later, they rode together to the small rise where James was buried. Ruth stood back as Eli knelt beside the grave marker, speaking softly to his brother. Then he motioned her forward, his good hand extended. "James would have liked you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "He always said I needed someone who wouldn't let me hide away from life." In town the following Sunday, Ruth felt the difference in how people greeted her. Mrs. Patterson embraced her warmly, and even Ben Morrison tipped his hat with genuine respect. No longer the Eastern curiosity or mail-order mistake, she had become one of them, a woman who had earned her place through endurance and love. That evening, standing on the porch of what was now truly their home, Ruth leaned against Eli's solid frame. "Did you ever imagine," she asked, "when you received that letter about a New York bride, that we would end up here?" Eli's arm tightened around her waist. "No, but I thank God every day for whatever twist of fate brought you to me." The first signs of spring arrived at the Harper Ranch, bringing with it not just the promise of renewal, but an unexpected visitor. Ruth Whitfield Harper was tending to the garden she had started when she spotted a carriage approaching. Her heart sank as she recognized the rigid posture of her mother, Margaret Whitfield, accompanied by a stern-looking gentleman clutching a leather portfolio. "I've come to take you home, Ruth," Margaret announced without preamble, her voice as cold as the winter they'd just endured. "This has gone on long enough. Your father and I have arranged everything." The lawyer, Mr. Holloway, produced documents declaring Ruth's marriage invalid on grounds of coercion and misrepresentation. Margaret's plan was clear: drag Ruth back to New York, fabricate a story about her being kidnapped, and salvage what remained of the family's reputation. "I'm expecting a child," Ruth said, one hand protectively covering her still flat stomach. The news visibly shocked her mother, whose face contorted with disgust. "All the more reason to return immediately. We'll handle the situation discreetly." Eli appeared from the barn, alerted by Ranger's barking. His weathered face hardened when he understood what was happening. "My wife isn't going anywhere she doesn't choose to go," he stated firmly, standing beside Ruth. Margaret scoffed. "Your wife was never meant to stay. This entire arrangement was a joke, a punishment. She belongs in society, not wasting away on this patch of dirt." Ruth felt a strength rise within her that had been building since her first days in Wyoming. "This patch of dirt is my home now. This man is my husband. And this child," she said, her voice unwavering, "will be born here, where it belongs." The confrontation drew attention. Mrs. Patterson arrived with fresh bread, followed by Ben Morrison and several other neighbors. They stood silently behind the couple, a wall of solidarity that spoke volumes. Margaret's face flushed with anger. "You choose this over everything we can offer? Over your birthright?" "I choose love," Ruth answered simply. "I choose respect and purpose, things I never found in your house." Defeated but furious, her mother departed, leaving a cloud of dust and bitter words. The lawyer, looking somewhat relieved, tipped his hat awkwardly before following his client. That evening, the community gathered at the church to celebrate not just the coming of spring, but Ruth's final transformation from outsider to one of their own. Women shared advice about childbirth and motherhood, while men clapped Eli on the back, congratulating him. As they rode home under a canopy of stars, Ruth leaned against her husband's shoulder. "I never thought I'd find the courage to stand up to her," she whispered. Eli squeezed her hand. "You've had that courage all along. It just needed the right soil to grow in." The autumn winds swept across the Wyoming plains, bringing a crisp chill to the air as Ruth Harper felt the first contractions begin. The pain came in waves, each one stronger than the last, causing her to grip the wooden bedpost until her knuckles turned white. Eli Harper never left her side, his weathered face etched with concern and wonder as he held her hand with his good one, whispering words of encouragement. "You're the strongest woman I know," he murmured, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "You've faced New York society and Wyoming blizzards. This baby doesn't stand a chance against your determination." Mrs. Patterson arrived just as Ruth's labor intensified, bringing her experienced hands and calming presence. The older woman had become like family since that first trip to Willow Creek, when Ruth had still been a stranger in a strange land. "Breathe through it, child," the midwife instructed, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "Your body knows what to do." Hours passed in a blur of pain and purpose. The ranch that had once seemed so foreign to Ruth now cradled her in its familiar embrace as she fought to bring their child into the world. Outside, Ranger kept vigil by the door, occasionally whining as if sensing the momentous event unfolding within. When the final push came, Ruth found strength she never knew she possessed. With Eli supporting her shoulders and Mrs. Patterson guiding the way, their daughter slipped into the world with a powerful cry that filled the cabin. "She's perfect," Eli whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as Mrs. Patterson placed the tiny red-faced infant on Omodarn Ruth's chest. His good hand trembled as he touched the downy head of his child. "Hope," Ruth said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope Harper." The name felt right on her tongue, a testament to everything they had overcome together. "Hope," Eli repeated, his voice thick with emotion. James would have loved her. In the days that followed, Ruth marveled at how naturally motherhood came to her. She, who had once been unable to boil water, now nurtured a life with confidence and joy. The transformation from pampered socialite to frontier mother was complete, yet it felt less like a change and more like a revelation of who she had always been beneath the trappings of her former life. Mrs. Patterson visited often, bringing gifts and wisdom in equal measure. The community that had once seemed so intimidating now embraced Ruth and her family, celebrating Hope's arrival with handmade blankets and practical offerings. At night, when Hope slept peacefully in the cradle Eli had crafted with his own hands, Ruth would often find him standing by the window, continuing his nightly ritual of prayer. Now, though, his whispered words included thanks for their daughter and the life they had built from what had begun as a cruel joke. "I never thought I could be this happy," Ruth confessed one evening, cradling Hope against her chest. "Neither did I," Eli replied, his eyes reflecting the same wonder she felt. "But here we are." The seasons changed, like pages turning in a well-worn book. 10 years passed since that snowy day when Ruth Whitfield had stepped off the train into Eli Harper's quiet life. Their ranch had flourished under their combined care, his steady hands and her determined spirit transforming the modest homestead into a thriving property. Hope, now a spirited 9-year-old with her father's quiet strength and her mother's refined grace, had been joined by twin brothers, James and William, and a baby sister, Sarah. The children filled the expanded cabin with laughter that echoed across the valley, healing old wounds neither Ruth nor Eli had believed could ever truly mend. On summer evenings, when the Wyoming sun painted the mountains gold and purple, they would sit together on the porch Eli had built with his own hands. Ruth would lean against her husband's shoulder, their fingers intertwined, watching their children chase fireflies across the yard where Ranger had once patrolled. The old dog was long gone now, but his successor, a black and white collie named Scout, kept vigilant watch over the Harper family. "Did you ever imagine this?" Ruth asked one evening, her voice soft as she nursed baby Sarah. "When you found me half frozen that first night, did you think we'd end up here?" Eli's weathered face creased with a smile as he gazed at his wife. The years had only deepened his love for her, this woman who had arrived as part of a cruel joke and stayed to become his partner in every sense. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted, "but I thank God every day for whatever madness possessed your mother to send you west." Ruth laughed, the sound carrying across the valley. "Margaret would be horrified to know she did me the greatest favor of my life." They had received word that her mother had passed the previous winter. Ruth had mourned not the woman who had been, but the mother she might have been. Charles Ashford, too, had faded into memory, a ghost from another life that no longer held power over her heart. The Pattersons and other neighbors from Willow Creek still visited regularly, marveling at how completely the New York socialite had transformed into a capable ranch wife who could birth calves, mend fences, and still serve tea with perfect manners when the occasion called for it. As twilight deepened into night, Ruth and Eli gathered their children for prayers, the same window ritual Eli had once shared with his brother James. Together, they thanked the stars for guiding them to each other, for the life they'd built from nothing but hope and hard work. What had begun as humiliation had blossomed into redemption. Their love story, written in calloused hands and tender moments, had become their greatest legacy, proof that even the cruelest intentions could, in the end, lead to the most unexpected joy.